Um, Good morning, everyone, and to who's joining us, and good afternoon to those of you, wherever you are. My name is Amani Aljak, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this third event of the Consortium on Gender Security and Human Rights, Spring 2025 Speaker Series, which is organized in collaboration with the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies with support from a Mellon grant affirming multivocal humanities. We are co-hosting this event with the UMass Boston Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance. Before I start introducing our speaker, I would like to acknowledge that UMass Boston and its surrounding communities are based on the unceded homelands of Massachusetts, Buckwheat, and other indigenous communities. We want to honor the diverse indigenous people enduring relationships with their traditional territories and to acknowledge that the way land passes from indigenous to non-indigenous control has been carried away and continued to through a violent history of genocide, forced removal, dispossession, and displacement of countless individuals and communities. All processes continue ongoing. We would also like to emphasize that land acknowledgement by themselves are not enough, but they need to be followed by action building solidarity. So while we welcome more people to join us, I just want to give you some info about how we are running this event today. After the talk, there will be time for questions. We encourage you to put your questions in the Zoom Q&A function at any time during this talk. The chat is now live, and we would love to have any of you who join us introduce yourselves, please. The chat will be live now and also near the end. So you can do the chat either at the beginning or at the end, but the Q&A is going to be open throughout the event. When you leave the webinar, a very short survey will pop up, and we'll be very grateful if you could take the time to fill these surveys. They are usual to the consortium kind of events. Finally, we would like for you to know and acknowledge that this event is being recorded, and the video will be available online on the consortium website and YouTube channel. So now it is my kind of pleasure to welcome our distinguished speaker, Dr. Catriona Standfield. Dr. Standfield is an assistant professor in the Department of Conflict Resolution, Global Governance, and Human Security at UMass Boston. And we are very excited to have her as a kind of a newcomer to UMass and a colleague with us here. She received her PhD in political sciences from Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, Syracuse University. Her research uses intersectional decolonial feminist lenses to analyze conflict mediation and diplomacy, centering on the practices of international organizations such as the UN. She uses an array of qualitative and quantitative methods to praise how conflict mediation and diplomacy are gendered, with particular attention to how everyday institutional practices sustain or challenge oppressive structures. Her book, which I really kind of I would like for many of you to check, is titled "The Politics of Women, Peace and Security in UN Mediation," published by Cambridge University Press. Her work has also been published in a wide range of kind of academic scholarly journals and has real significance on the policy world. Dr. Stanfield talk today is entitled "A Feminist Perspective of Women and Gender in UN Conflict Mediation." Please join me in welcoming Catriona Standfield. Catriona?
Thank you so much. I am going to start my screen sharing here. Great. So good morning or afternoon or perhaps even evening, depending on where you might be in the world. It's really a pleasure to be here virtually with you. Um, uh, so Uh, Before beginning, I'd like to additionally acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the lands of the Nipmuc people. So I'm over in central Massachusetts. So here, our First Nations are the Nipmuc people, and additionally acknowledging the sort of repeated and ongoing history of violent dispossession, and stating that I recognize that history, and to pay my respects to the First Nations elders, past, present, emerging, and reaffirming, I hope, all of our commitment to reparative action. I'd also like to express my very sincere thanks to the Consortium for Gender Security and Human Rights for sponsoring this event, in addition to my department, particularly Professor Carol Cohn, and especially Claire Kendrick, who is working behind the scenes to make this event run smoothly, which is no small feat, and of course, Professor Amani Aljak for facilitating today's talk. So today I'm very happy to get to share with you some insights from my first book. As mentioned, it's The Politics of Women, Peace and Security in United Nations Mediation. Bit of a long title, but it came out just at the start of January with Cambridge University Press. Now, this talk is not going to exhaustively cover the findings of the book. Instead, I'm going to focus more on what I think its implications are for fostering feminist and decolonial approaches to conflict mediation, specifically focusing on that sort of high-level international organization space. I think that as we are dealing with significant backlash to gender equality, women's rights, LGBTIAQ plus rights, and the like, we really need to take these opportunities to step back and think about, what is it that we are fighting for and what futures do we want to create? This is the kind of work that the consortium engages in through its project, the Feminist Roadmap for Sustainable Peace and Planet. And I am really committed to making spaces for imagination, as difficult as it can be, because this is what can keep us energized and enthusiastic, and continuing to fight through very, very difficult times. So for those who are interested in learning more about the book, if you're part of the UMass Boston community, it's available through the Healy Library as an ebook, and it's also available online in paperback and ebook formats. And I'll also be very happy to field further questions about it in the Q&A. I think we'll have time for that. So if there's anything that you'd like me to get into in more depth, just let me know. So the first half of this talk will focus on where the project began, and just provide an overview of my argument and key findings. And then the second half will really focus on the implications, what I think decolonial feminist approaches or principles what they can do to really inform ways forward and foster some more creative approaches so that we don't keep sort of doing the same things over and over again. So I started thinking about this topic a very long time ago as an undergraduate. I've been living with this project for a very, very long time. So in 2011, I did an undergraduate research internship. So if any of you are undergrads, you never know where your research experiences might lead you. I did this with the UN's Special Advisor to the Secretary General in Cyprus. And this is basically the UN's facilitator, mediator in the Cyprus peace talks, which have been going on since the 1960s. Very briefly, Cyprus is basically divided into two, Greek Cypriot South and a Turkish Cypriot North, and talks have been going on for a very, very long time to reunify the island. At that time, so this is late 2011 to early 2012, the lack of women's participation in the peace process had always been an issue, but it began to rise to sort of an issue of concern for the UN team, not least because it sort of showed that the UN was really lagging in the implementation of what's called the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. And if you're not familiar with this is something that sort of really got its legs in the year 2000 when a coalition of transnational feminist civil society and elected members of the UN Security Council, so countries like Jamaica and Bangladesh in particular, campaigned for the adoption of Resolution 1325. And a resolution is just a decision of the Security Council. And this Resolution 1325 became the foundation of this Women, Peace and Security agenda. And in Resolution 1325, the Security Council committed to increasing the representation of women at all decision-making levels in national, regional, and international institutions and mechanisms for the prevention, management, and resolution of conflict. Again, like all UN documents, it just rolls off the tongue. But basically, making conflict resolution more gender sensitive and inclusive of women. And all 10 of the Women, Peace and Security Council resolutions that have been adopted up to 2019 have something to say about increasing women's participation and making peace and security decision-making more cognizant of the connections between gender and conflict. Later Women, Peace and Security resolutions even strengthened language on women's participation, really stressing that it should be full, equal, meaningful, and safe. And they also singled out UN-sponsored peace talks as a target for implementation. The UN is quite active in the mediation space. Its role is changing and declining somewhat, but particularly in this sort of early post-Cold War period of like the 90s, the early 2000s, the UN was sponsoring a lot of talks. So it's not just states that are singled out for this, it's also the UN. So one feminist campaigner who worked for the adoption of 1325 hoped that the agenda could, quote, make photos of only male leaders at peace negotiating tables starkly outdated. But fast forwarding to 2011 in Cyprus, that picture had not changed much at all. And literally you could go and look at the photos of talks on the UN's mission website and you'd see maybe a few women in the UN's team, but in the Cypriot, Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot teams, it would be all men sitting at the table. There were, when I was there, I think one junior woman on each side. And of course, they were assigned as the gender experts or the gender focal points because of this assumption that, you know, women must be gender experts by nature, right? So this was also happening in a context of an extremely activated women's civil society. So Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot women were working in this very detailed way on coming up with proposals for every single chapter of the negotiations, you know, extensive, thoughtful recommendations on what a future Cyprus could look like. But, you know, despite all of this work, it was unclear that the negotiators thought about gender at all, or that any of these recommendations made it into negotiating texts. So I came away from this experience, you know, having met and talked to many of the different participants, really perplexed at how it was that those who were most committed to solving the conflict were excluded from the talks. So, you know, well, that sounds a bit naive, doesn't it, right? Of course, women are excluded. And, you know, it's very easy to find simple explanations for women's exclusion from peace mediation. And these usually focus on things like the political will of the conflict parties, you know, the fact that there are like high-level, hard security issues at stake, etc. And in the UN system, you know, Sanam Narahi Andalini, who wrote this quite foundational book, talked about a triple A syndrome in the UN of apathy, ad hoc approaches, and institutional amnesia. And it's still very, very common to hear these put forward as reasons for why the UN is not really able to implement women, peace, and security in the processes that it sponsors. But apathy or under-resourcing or even, a lack of institutional knowledge are not really explanations, but they are actually just reflections of how an institution ascribes value. So understanding who and what UN mediation values and how this is gendered means delving into the everyday institutional common sense behind UN mediation that has shaped how the UN has translated WPS into its mundane daily procedures, as well as high-profile political talks. So I really began by just asking very basic questions about how the UN thinks about and practices mediation and the women, peace, and security agenda. And it's these questions that have really informed the approach I've taken throughout the project. And the foundational principle is really just to not take any of these things for granted, to really ask what people mean when they say mediation. So the UN defines mediation as a process, quote, whereby a third party assists two or more parties with their consent to prevent, manage, or resolve a conflict by helping them to develop mutually acceptable agreements. So mediation is a consensual form of conflict resolution. Fine, but what this definition doesn't tell us is that we can also think of UN mediation as going beyond any single mediation process to encompass the formal and informal practices, narratives, and subject positions or roles that are made available to different kinds of people within the institution. And this goes across, the peace talks happening in different places, through to, the headquarters at the UN, where the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, advises on mediation practice, pulls together guidance manuals and the like. And it also includes these big legal and normative frameworks like the UN Charter and Women, Peace and Security. So I took a lot of cues from feminist international relations, feminist scholarship of institutions, and also people who think about social practices to look through this particular social lens into institutions, where instead of thinking of them as just like these formal structures, considering them as very dynamic fields of social activity that are organized around specific logics. And by that, I mean answers to the question, what is it that we do here, right? What's at stake in what we're doing here? And people really struggle with one another to provide definitive answers to those questions, which makes sense, because if you can answer this question, you can really shape, right, how an institution operates, who has power, and the like. And these struggles play out through the narratives, practices, and subject positions I mentioned earlier. So applying this to UN mediation, a central question, or really three questions, right, is what is the role of the UN in mediation? What counts as good mediation practice? And who is a good mediation practitioner? And there are really two main answers to this question. Elodie Convert uses the terms art and science to distinguish between these two answers. On the one hand, we have this traditional approach to UN mediation as a diplomatic art of managing relationships. And on the other, we have this scientific approach, by which we mean this sort of post-Cold War focus on expert governance, really bringing technical expertise to defining and managing policy problems. And so I built upon Convert's argument about art and science to think, well, okay, if these art and science logics are there, how are they gendered and how are they shaping what's possible for women, peace and security? In addition, following decolonial feminists such as Nuria Lugones, I use a concept of gender as deeply enmeshed in colonial modernity. That is, not just layering colonial dynamics and gender on one another, but actually thinking about how the very categories that we use to talk about gender have been produced through, 500 years of colonial modernity. So when I'm talking about gender throughout this project, I'm talking about gender as a colonial construct. And sometimes I use this phrase gendered and colonial to really kind of remind the reader about that. And this is really shaping the incorporation of women, peace and security. In terms of methods and sources, I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A if you have specific questions. But really, I had to try, my big challenge, right, was to sort of get at the everyday practices of an institution that's not terribly accessible to outsiders. I wasn't able to observe a mediation process for pretty obvious reasons, right, of sensitivity and secrecy. But I still had to kind of get into, how are people answering these big questions about UN mediation? How are they thinking about it? How are they practicing it? What kinds of people are seen as like as fitting certain roles within mediation? So I gathered a lot of different sources that would help me gain a window into these dynamics. So I talked to a lot of UN mediation practitioners. I gathered a lot of primary documents, texts, guidance, manuals in particular, and I observed some training on how I basically observed how the UN sort of trains people on women, peace and security in mediation. And if you want to know about how an institution thinks about something, how it trains people is quite revealing in a lot of different ways. So I think through this approach, I was able to really identify these key logics and how they operate in these gendered and colonial ways to shape outcomes for women, peace and security. So let's look at those now. So the logics of UN mediation as an art and a science both shape the incorporation of the women, peace and security agenda, but they do so in quite different ways. So this is really important because we often talk about things being gendered, but the question I think is then how are things gendered? And it turns out that in one context, we can see a few different ways of things being gendered. So the logic of UN mediation as a science has in many respects successfully co-opted the women, peace and security agenda. So this logic is organized around ideas of efficiency, linearity, and expertise. And the key thing at stake here is the smooth functioning of a peace process that will, through the application of the appropriate kind of expertise, produce sustainable peace, right? And so the women, peace and security agenda in the form of gender expertise in particular can be harnessed to promote the efficiency of UN mediation. So this generates practices like gender-sensitive conflict analysis and the circulation of so-called best practices in implementing women, peace and security. So both of these conflict analysis and best practices are pre-existing practices, but WPS sort of gets layered into them in ways that end up really limiting its more transformative insights about how gender and conflict are related to one another. So, for instance, the best practices that the UN adopts with or circulates with regard to women, peace and security emphasize establishing consultative forums for local women over direct political participation. And I saw this play out in very, very interesting ways. I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But basically what this does, because this is seen as the best practice, it becomes the sort of first option. And this really undermines this understanding in the women, peace and security agenda of full, equal and meaningful participation, right? If people are getting shoved straight into a consultative forum rather than having a place made for them at a peace table. So these practices of expertise creation and consultation co-constitute this subject position or stereotyped role of the women. And throughout UN mediation narratives, the women are talked about constantly as the women. That's why I put it in quotation marks. These refer to local women who end up figuring as racialized, right? This is part of the colonial aspect of it, racialized local laborers and informants who can basically work in service of UN processes from which they may ultimately be excluded. So they can go and legitimize a process in their community or provide information, but the best that they can hope for is being put into a consultative forum. Meanwhile, the logic of mediation as an art leads not to cooptation, but more to simple marginalization and exclusion of women and gender. So this logic prioritizes relationships and political judgment rather than technical expertise. And the biggest issue at stake in this logic is for the mediator to get and keep the consent of the conflict parties to be in talks and to get an urgent stop to the violence. So two key practices that emerge from this understanding of mediation are firstly, emotional labor, and secondly, discretion. So UN mediators practice emotional labor, such as empathetic listening, to manage conflict parties who are, of course, seen as male combatants and political leaders. So this practice really hinges on male bonding in informal settings, and this means including women can be a risky proposition because it will upset those dynamics of male bonding. UN mediators also continue to exercise a quite significant degree of discretion over the women, peace and security agenda's implementation in their work. So mediators may choose not to prioritize women, peace and security because they see it as incompatible with speedy negotiated settlements. And in that case, pursuing inclusion may mean the mediator is even seen as having poor political judgment. And additionally, promoting women's inclusion can draw accusations of partiality on the part of the UN mediator, which is really significant for the UN because their whole thing is impartiality. So again, bringing women into a process may be seen as really quite risky. These narratives and practices co-constitute the subject of the mediator as a political man. So the ways in which a good mediator is described in the UN's documentation really draw on a lot of very masculinized traits and skills, as well as practices that shape the selection and appointment of UN mediators, which continue to elevate male candidates with diplomatic or particular kinds of diplomatic and political expertise over similarly qualified women. And there's additionally a colonial hierarchy of masculinities happening here too, where the mediator almost figures as a paternal figure who has to manage these somewhat childlike, unruly, racialized conflict parties. So the logic of UN mediation as a science, right, going back to that, is dominant, but it's certainly not hegemonic. It's not the only way people think about things. The logic of UN mediation as an art is embedded in diplomacy and really shaped the early development of UN mediation. And while the logic of UN mediation as a science has really been dominant in the post-Cold War period, its limitations are becoming clearer to scholars and practitioners, and I will get into that in the next half of the talk. But the dominance of senior UN mediators in really shaping the institution, most of whom have diplomatic expertise and backgrounds, means that there's going to be sort of a continued contestation between these two logics until they're displaced by something else. So these are not very helpful or hopeful conclusions, I understand, but bear with me, it will get better. I know that if you're a gender expert who has logged on to try to get some concrete ideas about how to promote women, peace and security mediation, you might be feeling a bit frustrated at this point in time, and I understand that too. So there's a middle ground approach here that we could take. We could say, well, if these are the two dominant logics, which one is better for women, peace, and security? And we could say, well, obviously, UN mediation as a science must be better for women, peace, and security because co-optation is better than, marginalization and exclusion. At least if there's, co-optation, there's a toehold, right? There's like a space for gender experts and local women to like get in and maybe like make some further room to put their perspectives forward. But I don't think that we're limited to choosing the lesser of two evils. And I think that it's really important, especially for people like myself. It's my job to kind of think about these things, to think, what could we be doing differently? How could we actually chart a different path forward and try to undo some of the worst aspects of these logics, right? The paternalism, the colonial attitudes, the exclusion of women, and the like. So rather than providing a list of specific concrete policy proposals, what I will do here instead is think about principles that I think we can adopt that might help us chart a better way forward. And these principles are about engaging across difference, solidarity, care, and accountability. And here I am really speaking to those whom I'm best situated to address. So feminist academics, feminist experts engaged with the UN, who are of or situated in the global north and who are part of this sort of international community shaping UN mediation. So we have an ology here, ontology, and really one way to start thinking about this is through this idea of worlding. Worlding is a concept that some people in international relations, particularly post-colonial scholars, use to talk about ontology, which is really just what we think our social worlds are made up of. Like, what is the stuff that constitutes our social worlds? And so worlds through this lens are not just different perspectives on the same thing, but entire systems of thought and practice in their own right. So everything is worlded, right? My perspective is worlded, UN mediation is worlded, the women, peace and security agenda is worlded, and they are embedded in a particular colonial modernity that presumes that there's just one single world and that they're the ones who can articulate it and understand it for other people. So from this perspective, gendered and colonial difference becomes just a matter of belief that can kind of be folded into the existing approaches or existing institutions. If instead we take this idea of worlds and ontological difference seriously, it means instead looking for opportunities to have what Naim Inayatullah calls knowledge encounters. So rather than trying to domesticate difference, how can we actually engage across difference, respecting difference? So one place that I suggest starting for this particular project is with the decolonization of gender expertise, particularly among gender experts and feminist academics. So there are a lot of critiques of the role of gender expertise, for instance, the instrumentalization of feminist knowledge, co-optation, and the like. And I agree with those, but I think that we also need to be much more forthright in stating how gender expertise sustains and benefits from colonial hierarchies among women. It's no accident that many gender experts in the UN are in or of the global north. Many are white women, right, that I spoke to. So these are women who have benefited from the turn towards seeing women, peace and security as a technical project, right? These developments have created professional opportunities, new jobs, consulting opportunities, and the like. So, gender experts are often the ones who are enacting things like consultations with the quote unquote women that don't really lead to learning from situated expertise, but are really about extracting information from the local sphere that they then turn into expertise that can be sort of recognized as such by other mediation practitioners. And even gender experts who are aware of and struggle against these logics may still find their expertise used to marginalize local women who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of their work. So in very practical terms, one approach might be to resist the drive to hold a capacity building training as the first mode of engagement with women in a context that you are new to, right, if you're a gender expert, and to instead have a much more humble desire for a knowledge encounter. So this really requires internationals operating from the assumption that they have something to learn from local people and local contexts. And here I'll say local is a very loaded word in its own right, and I know I'm shorthanding a lot of things there. So we can talk about that more in the Q&A if you like. And the Academy is certainly not immune to these dynamics as well. It's very notable that there is a network of research centres in the global north on women, peace and security that in itself kind of buttresses colonial hierarchies of knowledge about gender and peace. And the way that scholars narrate women, peace and security, gender can often fall into what Françoise Vergès calls narratives of civilizational feminism, which erases the history of colonialism and global South women and really centers European women as kind of the sort of proponents of feminism and peace. And in addition, I have to recognize that global North academics like myself have come to use concepts like decoloniality and intersectionality in our work on WPS, while, as Marsha Henry argues, the Black and Indigenous women who created them are so often left out. So thinking about knowledge encounters and difference, right, we then have to take the additional step of recognizing that global feminist and womanist responses to women, peace and security, such as those of local women engaged in mediation, are coming from differentiated worlds, and that how people use or refuse the women, peace and security agenda may really challenge civilizational feminist narratives of what WPS is and what it should achieve. So rather than trying to discipline the women into engaging WPS in sort of recognized ways, we should instead be using our privileges and access to really shatter this understanding that there is anything called such as the women, and to make much more space for unruly and contentious femininities. The next principle I want to talk about is solidarity. So rather than shoring up hierarchies, how could we rewrite mediation such that it allows us to transcend some of these binaries like art or science or local and international? Meera Sabaratnam argues that it's necessary to, quote, contemplate abandoning intervention's central intellectual assumptions, its modes of operation, and its political structures in order to remake a terrain for solidaristic engagement and, where appropriate, post-colonial reparation, unquote. If we imagine such a change is possible, and I really invite us all to imagine that, we could conceive of a place for the UN, but on radically different grounds. I think that this would mean emphasizing the UN's legitimacy as a mediator, not in terms of its expertise, but in terms of its moral authority as an organization with near universal global membership, as well as its charter values, which Global South had an extremely important role in writing, and which again gets left out in narratives of the UN's creation. It also means that the UN can create spaces that allow people to have knowledge encounters rather than, again, sort of disciplining people to engage in specific ways with mediation. One tactic might be for UN people to stop making the UN the center of stories about what works in mediation. Best practices often evaluate the incorporation of women, peace and security in mediation in terms of what it does for the UN and its effectiveness, not by whether it actually serves the women engaged in this or various other communities who engage with the UN or who are affected by its work. So again, this means adopting positions of humility and alterity so that the UN can actually be open to engaging with these different ontologies of peace. Moreover, Sandler and Gertz argue that the UN has a role to play in promoting feminist multilateralism by better funding women's organizations and using its convening power. So this is where the logic of, reparation can be invoked. In the mediation space, the UN can help to mobilize resources to support what is already working rather than imposing its best practices. So this may mean making participation more accessible by providing logistical support and money for time spent on this labor, particularly if people are being consulted for their expert knowledge on a context. And the UN can use its convening power to bring people together in peer-to-peer learning opportunities that facilitate horizontal knowledge transfers. UN Women does this a bit, which is great, but UN Women also wants to put its brand on everything and put itself at the forefront of these narratives. And I do think that this work can and should continue, but the UN needs to take a step back from the limelight. And I'm not the only person saying this as well. The next is care and accountability. So accountability is a really big challenge for mediation because it is such an exclusive endeavor. And there is a politics of disposability, is what Subbaratham calls it, in international mediation, or in international intervention broadly, that really says that kind of doesn't matter if local people benefit or not, right? And this is borne out in how field level staff spend huge amounts of time demonstrating to headquarters and donors their accountability through compliance with those structures, while not being meaningfully accountable to the populations whom they are working amongst. So despite the good intentions of many of these people, they really, for the most part, don't suffer firsthand the consequences of failed agreements or bad agreements, and they really just tend to parlay their experience into the next posting, right, which helps their careers. So people care, but care is not innocent. It's deeply political, and it has to be reflexively practiced. So unequal forms of care are actually really central to UN mediation and the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Mediators exercise paternal care over the unruly conflict parties, while local women care for the UN by providing unpaid labor to smooth its work. Instead, feminist care ethics emphasize that care must be built on relationality that's grounded in context. And a decolonial ethic of care further argues for the creation of, quote, deep relation, which, as Robbie Shilliam puts it, quote, binds different domains together, individual, social, geographical, and spiritual, in the pursuit of restitutive justice, end quote. A care ethic of mediation may mean a stronger commitment to actually using discretion, but in different ways, to address problems and needs in context, and to expand the moral circle of care beyond conflict parties. It can also be used to create more inclusive spaces where relations of care can develop among different people. And this goes beyond simply socializing international interveners to local contexts, to tying people's fortunes together in meaningful ways. So a relational approach to care as a part of solidarity, again, has to have accountability as a part of it. And the accountability of a UN mediator is often framed in terms of, again, maintaining impartiality so that the conflict parties will stay at the table and have trust in the process. UN missions also operate with the consent of the host country, meaning that it's those officials that tend to be prioritized in accountability relationships. Meanwhile, the accountability of the mediator and their team to women's civil society or even these consultative forums that they set up is really unclear. The secrecy of a process may, again, in the Cypriot case, prevent these women's boards from even knowing if their proposals have made it into negotiations in a meaningful way. In reporting on UN mediation, missions report upward to the Security Council, and they may put these reports on their website, but how helpful they are is really questionable. They're not translated into local languages, for instance. A lot of people don't have reliable internet access and the like. And the reports are really, again, they're oriented to what the UN cares about. And so they may not even even if they were widely accessible, they may not really include information that's terribly meaningful to people, where the UN is operating, who are trying to make sense of if this is having a positive impact on their community or not. So a different approach is to embrace a relational approach to accountability, which focuses on transparent communication, mutual respect, and reciprocity, meaning that I can hold you accountable and you can hold me accountable. And this means also locating political consciousness and capacity, right, with local people as well as with the international mediation staff. It also has to be flexible. And I think the really key thing here is that any meaningful accountability structure has to actually be able to disrupt a mediation process. And currently, we just don't have a very good framework for thinking about this. Any disruption is usually seen as spoiling and in bad faith. But, if local women's groups or queer groups or ethnic minorities are seeing that a deal on the table is a bad one, they should be able to say that and push for alternatives. So there's a role for consultation here, right? But as deep ongoing engagement and not just extracting information. The UN could put effort into figuring out what kinds of information people would like to know, how best to communicate, how the UN will use feedback, and what will happen if it can't use feedback for one reason or another. The UN often engages with local people with this sense of like, we have to manage expectations and we have to tell them what's realistic. And to be fair, the UN suffers from a lot of unrealistic expectations about what it can and can't do. But instead of just imposing that as a first point of contact, why not actually have a conversation and figure out how to be in relation with one another and how to communicate so that this becomes a conversation rather than just managing, again, how subalterns should be engaging with the UN. So summing up, it's no mistake that, in the last 25 years, we've seen a really remarkable adoption of feminist concerns in traditionally masculinized peace and security institutions. And the interplay of women's civil society, insider feminists, and traditional power structures have generated processes of reform like the Women, Peace and Security Agenda that are riven with tensions. UN mediation has really changed in the same period, having adopted this kind of scientific approach that is still actually quite unproven and deeply contested. So both the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and dominant mediation approaches are facing deep questions about whether they can deliver anything like sustainable peace, and yet doing things differently is dismissed as being too risky. And this has really created a situation in which we have these ever more self-referential discussions among mediation professionals that really foreclose, I think, creative thinking and solidarity, and just kind of keep people trapped in these dominant narratives about what mediation is and how it should be practiced. And the really great irony here is that this may be rendering UN mediation even more irrelevant over time, right? As people, strive to establish themselves as having the best practices. At the same time, many conflict parties are turning away from the UN. So unless it can embrace risky and messy politics and new principles such as solidarity, care, and accountability, I think that the UN is going to stay far behind the many feminist actors around the world who are already doing this creative, risky work to keep themselves and their communities safe. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Catriona, for such an illuminating talk. We really appreciate it. So now we have around 20 plus minutes for Q&A, and please enter your questions into the Q&A function of this Zoom tab. And I'll be happy to kind of just read some of the questions as they come. I have a question for you before we kind of, as we get one. This is really kind of a timely talk given all that is happening in the world right now with all these conflicts and the lack of successful kind of mediation or post-conflict processes. And my question is, in your work, what kind of lessons that have been learned from previous wars, historical wars, that has currently been used or applied to resolve some of or try to kind of use in any kind of conflict, post-conflict measures in the current war? I'm particularly intrigued about kind of your emphasis on the colonial aspects of how these kind of mediation and post-conflict resolutions mechanism adopted by the UN have been viewed by people in the global south as colonial, but also how can we talk about solidarity in a time where certain conflicts are privileged over others. We see that what is happening in Ukraine and other parts of the globe.
Yeah. Okay, so I think there's like maybe 3 really important questions there. I'll start with this solidarity part. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, why, Sudan is a great example, right? A really underreported, overlooked conflict that is disastrous, millions of people displaced, famine, extensive war crimes. Just the scope of the conflict in Sudan is really mind-boggling, and yet we are just not really hearing about it the same way that we hear about other conflicts. And so, it's this question of solidarity is like, by whom and for whom. And so this isn't necessarily like a great answer to your question, but one, I think, thing about that is key to solidarity is the again, this idea that people's fortunes are tied together. And so, obviously there's a very racial component here when we look at Ukraine. Ukrainians, rightly garnered a lot of sympathy for their plight. But, it was very evident that for a lot of Europeans and, white North Americans, that they were easier to empathize with, right? Because, they look like us, right? And so how do we teach people to care about people who, don't look like them? And how do we get people to think about, not these kind of trite aphorisms of like, oh, we're all human, but this real genuine like commitment to humanity, right? And this rather than being afraid of difference, like leaning into difference and engaging across difference. Again, so I do think that the UN has a very particular advantage in this respect, again, because of its universal composition, at least in the General Assembly, and how it can, right? Security Council is a bit different, but it can really be a voice for, these solidaristic projects. What started as, third world politics, and is now sort of today talked about sort of the project of the Global South, are exactly about the universal applicability of these standards, rather than their partial applicability, right? This has always been the great hypocrisy that's been pointed out by Global South projects, is that European states, North American states, colonial states have often talked about the rule of law, but have not practiced the rule of law. So how do we make these things actually as universal as they were promised to be? The question of lessons learnt. So the UN went through some really significant crises in the 1990s with failures of peacekeeping, in Rwanda, most notably, but also in the former Yugoslavia. And so these big peacekeeping reviews came out with this idea of, learning lessons. And the UN puts a lot of time and effort into after action reporting, and summarizing, what has or hasn't worked. But again, I think that it tends to learn the wrong lessons. So again, it tends to think about lessons learned in terms of what has worked for the UN. So, from the UN's perspective, a speedy negotiated settlement is a good thing, right? The contents of that settlement, raise a lot of other questions. So one of the big lessons that has come out of all of this for the UN is adopting these very technical approaches like process design, right? That if we can get the process right, this will ensure that we kind of get to a negotiated solution sooner rather than later. But what that tends to do is it makes politics an inconvenience rather than central to the mission of mediation, because what is conflict if not just politics in its rawest form? And so yeah, the way that it articulates its best practices and its lessons learnt still, I think, miss a lot, right? And again, I think that, there are a lot of people within the UN who are deeply dissatisfied with how the UN goes about things. And I would hear these people sort of complain to me, right? Because I'm an outsider, so they're not too worried about talking to me in that context. People they don't want to just do the same thing over and over again in different contexts. Like, they do want to feel like they're making a difference. And yet the structures and incentives are not set up for that currently.
Thank you so much, Catriona. So we have two questions and a comment, and I will just read them as they come. The first question is from Larissa Costa, and they're asking, how do you see the women's mediator networks, and what kind of role they could play in changing UN mediation practices?
Thank you, Larissa, for that great question. Yes, so just for everyone's kind of background, there are quite a few women's mediation networks now in a lot of different areas of the globe. They tend to be organized regionally. So the Nordics, I think, really kind of got this started, but there's Commonwealth women's mediator networks, and there is FemWise in Africa, right, which is sort of related to the African Union's work and the Office of the Special Envoy on Women, Peace and Security in the AU, Madame Diop. So I have mixed feelings about women's mediation networks. I know what purpose they're serving. What they're trying to do is forestall the criticism that there are no qualified women available to participate in mediation, which is a common refrain that you still hear. And it's very convenient to be able to point to a women's mediation network and say, well, actually, look, we have these women. In some mediation networks, I think they really focus on very high-level women, former foreign ministers. So the Nordics in particular have a lot of very high-level women in their networks. And again, I see good reasons for that. Because, as I said, similarly qualified women are not getting appointed to UN mediator roles compared to men with similar profiles. So they are, important for challenging these ideas about, who's in the candidate pool, basically. And they can also facilitate those peer-to-peer knowledge exchanges, which I think can be really, really helpful. The one question I have is, like, to what extent, and this is always a challenge, right? Working within institutions, to what extent are you challenging or upholding them? And I think women's mediator networks that focus sort of solely on very elite women are sometimes falling back into the same trap, I think, of very elite and secretive and sort of high-level track one mediation that WPS is really supposed to be kind of militating against. That broadening inclusion, broadening the peace table is really where we need to be going. So there are other, different models. So FemWise is very interesting because they have a very different model for who can join FemWise. And it's much broader in scope. If you have, been mediating conflicts in your local community, you can put yourself forward for FemWise. And I personally think that is a really interesting model that women's mediator networks should foster, right? Because again, it's assuming that strengths lie in the existing practices of very diverse women, rather than presuming that, you know, it's just attached to having had a very narrow and elite set of experience. So I have complicated feelings about it. Larissa, great question. Thanks.
Sure. And the second comment is from Professor Nada Ali. She's saying, thank you for this wonderful talk. Catriona, having been involved in the campaign of Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, and the campaign that has involved sustained activism by women and feminist organizations and movement, including feminist and women organizations from countries in the global south. Professor Ali says that she agrees with the recommendations on the need for sustaining knowledge encounters, decolonizing gender expertise, emphasizing experience rather than the lack of capacity, and the challenging assumptions regarding the homogeneity of women. Do you have anything to kind of respond to Professor Ali's comment?
Oh, no, just to, well, I mean, yes, to say thank you. Firstly, Dr. Nada Mustafa Ali is at UMass Boston as well. And for those who may not be familiar with her work, I really encourage you to go and look that up. It's amazing to have such a wonderful feminist colleague working in this WPS space. It's a real treat because I haven't experienced that before. And, you know, I think actually the points, you know, that Nada put forward in her comment are really just worth remembering and taking on board, to really emphasize this understanding that as much as there are these civilizational feminisms and you know, Eurocentric approaches to gender, that there is also a very rich and complex tapestry of transnational feminism and womanist approaches that if we are spending all of our time critiquing, say, global North gender experts, it can become really easy to fall into the thing that we're critiquing, right? This idea that, well, there's just this like hegemonic Western feminist project that gets imposed on people. And it's very, very important, if you're engaged in that critique, to constantly step back and be careful about not then actually steamrolling over all the people that are actually doing really amazing work all around the world from a variety of different standpoints. So it's just that balancing act that we have to follow. And this is why I sort of also talk a lot about the UN as a Global South project, because as much as the UN it is complicit in sort of intervening on people in a colonial fashion, it is also the product of, you know, go and look at the San Francisco conference participants, right? And just, you know, go and Google it, go and have a look and see who was there and who was part of writing the UN Charter, right? Yes, the great powers really had a big influence on the process, but, you know, I think if we take Global South agency seriously, we can't say that they have agency in some cases and then discount it in others, right? We instead have to look at the process of contestation and think about how the UN has actually been a forum for really incredible ideas to come to the fore, like the new international economic order, you know, the new idea of human development rather than, you know, using gross domestic product to measure human well-being, right? Those are Global South, right, originated ideas, and a lot of the UN's gender machinery was originated by women from the Global South, right? So there's a whole history there, and I encourage us to be sort of nuanced in how we talk about these dynamics in the UN.
Sure. There is a question from Nancy Achu. I hope that I'm not kind of butchering your last name, Nancy. The question is from the perspective of colonialism. Do you think the reason why people are beginning to move away from the UN peace building mechanism is because of the massive deconstruction of the fact that the UN was once associated with colonialism, unassociated to colonialism, the way it's written?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So I think there's like good faith and bad faith arguments against the UN, right? The good faith arguments are, a lot of the things that we've been discussing here today, the top-down approaches, the sort of lack of responsiveness from international interveners, even ranging through to, straight out abuse, right, of local communities by, UN peacekeeping missions, for instance. So those are all sort of good faith, right, issues. But, there are also bad faith critiques, and I think we have to be careful in separating those out. There are, the UN, as a lot of mediators put it, the UN comes with normative baggage, right? Because of its charter values, because of things like women, peace, and security, but also other normative frameworks like children and armed conflict. That, when the UN comes into a mediation context, it sort of can't leave those things behind. That it must be impartial with respect to the conflict parties, but it is not neutral with respect to international law and norms. So the UN simply cannot sign on to an agreement, for instance, that gives people amnesty for war crimes. The UN just simply cannot do that. So it is bound in ways that maybe other mediators aren't. And so, again, you have to think about, okay, well, if you want a quick agreement, you can have a quick agreement by having like a very biased mediation where, so like not necessarily quick, but the Oslo Accords, right? A really biased mediator, the United States, sort of clearly favoring the Israeli side, is able to sort of coerce, right, the talks to a point, right, to get an agreement. And so, that's effective in terms of getting an agreement, but not necessarily effective in terms of actually dealing with the conflict. So depending on the dynamics of the conflict parties, right, they may not want the UN for a variety of reasons because they feel like they might be disadvantaged by it. Sometimes they just don't want the UN to come in because they feel like it will internationalize a conflict even more. So again, separating out those reasons is really important. And I do think that we see, again, we have to be sort of nuanced, right? We see a lot of leaders of countries or of, conflict parties who they don't necessarily have the best interests of their people in mind, right? They're happy to use these very cynical arguments of like, well, feminism is a Western invention, right? Because they don't want to make room for the demands of women, right? So Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot negotiators all the time are telling women like, wait until later. Cynthia Enloe calls later a patriarchal time zone, right? Because nationalist elites, even during the post or the decolonization era, right? A lot of nationalist male elites did not make space for, did not want to make space for women's demands, right? And tried to subordinate them to the nationalist project. So we see a lot of that as well. So I think we have to kind of take it case by case and sort of think about, what are the actual dynamics and what are the good faith versus bad faith critiques. I guess what I come down to is like, if we didn't, sort of agree with the saying, if we didn't have the UN, we'd probably have to invent it. I think that we are sort of, we have this framework, and my approach is how can we sort of radically restructure it so that it does have that legitimacy, right, among ordinary people that it desperately needs.
So there is a question from Judith Morley. And the question is, how can the UN mediators balance the arts and science to ensure women political participation and peace building, especially in the global south? Consider the achievement of the new elected Namibian woman president, President Netumbo Nandi-Tua. So how could they consider the achievement of the newly elected president in Namibia?
Okay, Judith, thank you so much for your question. So I will start by saying I don't really know much at all about the Namibian context, right? But I think sort of your question gets at to what extent do UN mediators like recognize female politicians or female leaders, right? So so this is where I actually want to reflect on a training that I observed, right? So in some cases, you know, where it's a president, it's very evident, right? You have to deal with the president, like that's a very important person. And there are a lot of questions about whether female leaders necessarily always lead to better outcomes for women, right? Generally speaking. So like Margaret Thatcher is a great example. Just because a woman is a leader doesn't mean that she's a feminist, right? And you know, we have to kind of again constantly challenge this idea that women are automatically experts in gender and that they're automatically feminists, because a lot of women collude with patriarchy, you know, with racism and the like, to benefit themselves and hold down other people. But this question of like who is recognized as political, right? Mediators use this phrase all the time, who is political. And political means that you've got like good political judgment, you've got this experience, you've got this sort of like feel for mediation. So being political is a really good thing. And if someone is not political, that's used to kind of dismiss them. And so in the training exercise I looked at, there was 2 days of training and they sat through all of these modules. This was UN political affairs officers from all around different field missions who came back to New York for this 2-day training on women, peace and security. Really great modules, really great speakers, like the content was really, really good. But then when they came to do like a simulation exercise, they got a fictional country situation, right? These are the conflict dynamics and like you have to come up with an approach, right? And in the packet they were told that there were important female politicians, not at the level of president or prime minister, but important local female politicians, right? But they immediately suggested a consultative forum for women, right? Because that's what they know. And so they sort of automatically slipped back into that, even though they just sat through a day and a half telling them that there are, you know, conflict dynamics are a lot more nuanced, right, than that. So the extent to which people can see the local context and understand it outside of the dominant frames that they're coming with, I think requires very different habits of mind than what you're trained to if you're trained as like a subject matter expert. Sometimes you're trained to come with particular frameworks on how to analyze a situation, conflict analysis tools and the like, but they may actually obscure more than they tell you. And to what extent can UN people, for instance, know that they're actually knowing how do they know what they know about the local context, right? Being much more reflective about those activities.
So we have about 3 minutes to go, and we do have a question and a couple of kind of entries here. So the question from Bridget Murphy about how can we encourage academic institutions to conduct research which serves the needs and gaps on the ground, rather than research which helps academia and policymakers better understand what is happening on the ground. Too often, we on the ground are filling the academia's knowledge gap, not ours. So we usually talk about the binary between the academia and the policy world. And I really appreciate this question from Bridget. Now they're asking about those on the grounds who are really not necessarily also not being acknowledged. So how the academia and the policy world address that?
Yeah. So I think what we have to do is be like really honest about what the incentives are for the production of academic knowledge and policy knowledge, and understand the limitations of, in my view, the limitations of, say, a journal article, an academic journal article, which goes behind a paywall, in really being like meaningful for co-creators of knowledge, right? Local people, right? And so I know Nada Mustafa Ali does this work really well. There are a lot of people who use very participatory methods and write up their research in very participatory ways, but they go beyond, right? They don't stop at the journal article and writing that up in a participatory way. Like you have to figure out what would be a meaningful product or meaningful outcome for the people who are helping you to create this knowledge, right? And I don't think that you can come in with preconceived ideas about what that should look like. It can take a lot of different forms, you know, film, radio, plays, written products, visual, it can take a lot of different forms. But again, it's this sort of humility of stepping back and thinking, well, just because I've got doctor in front of my name, that doesn't mean that I actually know what's going to be meaningful to people that I'm working with. And yeah, absolutely, there's this logic of sort of extracting information that happens both in academia and in the policy space. And maybe we have to flip this a little bit and, ask ourselves, why should people participate? Academics and policymakers often come with this assumption that, well, of course people want to participate. Like, why shouldn't they? Because I'm doing this great thing. And instead we have to ask ourselves, why should they want to? Why should they want to give up their time? Why should they want to talk to a random person who's not had any experience in their country, and sometimes, I think it's just, for me personally, sometimes I just like exit myself from things. Like, I think there are things that I'm better positioned to do. Like, it's not important for me to be in the room, right? Even though that might legitimate me in different ways, sometimes it's better to step to the side and let other people have the microphone and then be involved in sometimes maybe quieter ways to disseminate and support the knowledge production. It's a really big question, which I know I haven't answered in full, but I think it's very, very important for all of us, and that we cannot just, especially, well-meaning white ladies like myself, we cannot just like say, well, we've got good intentions and that lets us off the hook. It really doesn't. We have to be much more reflexive than that.
So before we have just two input and one follow-up question from Nancy. Her follow-up question is, how can young female peace advocates become UN mediators? Which strategies or platform can provide this opportunity? There is a comment from Cornelia West saying that UNHCR, like Resolution 1325, was a result of Namibia,
Yes.
not the West. And
Yes.
Cornelia provided a link to kind of follow up on that. So this is great. Thank you. And
Yes.
then we'll conclude by Nancy's question about young female who wants to be kind of mediators.
Yeah.
Where should they go?
So no, absolutely. Thank you, Cornelia. Yes, there was a really important declaration that preceded 1325 that Namibia was really instrumental in. Currently, honestly, there isn't a pathway for a young woman to become a UN mediator, like a UN special representative. You've got to go and become a president or a foreign minister of your own country, and then maybe your country will advocate for you to become a mediator. Like, very, very frankly. That doesn't mean that you can't do mediation work and shouldn't do mediation work, and think of it more expansively. Think of the, yes, and Namibia was the sponsor and penholder of 1325, right? Absolutely. So thinking, again, thinking beyond the UN, right, in some respects, I think is really important. Thinking about how we can do this work in our own communities is really important. And perhaps at the end of the day, a little bit more meaningful, right? And if you become a UN mediator eventually, let me know, because I'd love to hear about your journey there. And I hope you do. Maybe things will change.
Sure. I think we'll conclude by this. Both Catriona and I will be available to take follow-up questions as well. But on behalf of the consortium, on behalf of Carol, Claire, and all the interns who have put so much work into these events, please join me in thanking Dr. Catriona for such a really amazing and engaged kind of presentation at a time where we really need to talk more about mediation and conflict resolution. Just to scale what is happening in our crazy world. But thank you so much for your talk, Catriona, and thank you to all of you who have joined us. I just want to remind all those who are here on Zoom to fill up the short survey, which is popping or will pop now, before you leave the webinar. And if you and just make sure that if you have any feedbacks, any suggestions, so that we can enhance our coming kind of events and talks. But thank you so much, and thank you to everybody for joining us. Have a great afternoon and evening.
Thank you very much, everyone.